photographs of 19th century cities, something unusual appears in the background. Massive stone buildings, enormous railway stations, government palaces with towering columns and elaborate domes, structures so large and complex that they seem to belong to a much later era. And yet, according to official records, many of these buildings were constructed within just a few years. But when you look closer, the timeline begins to feel strangely compressed. Some structures appear on maps before their supposed construction dates. In other cases, early documents describe renovations or restorations rather than the beginning of construction. And occasionally, the historical record uses a curious phrase: the building was already there. This raises an interesting question. If these buildings were not always newly constructed, then when did they first appear? And more importantly, who actually built them? During the 19th century, many cities across Europe and North America went through a period of intense transformation. Streets were widened, entire districts were rebuilt, and new public buildings began to define the growing urban landscape. The official explanation is straightforward. As industry expanded and cities grew, governments and private investors funded an enormous wave of construction. Railway stations, museums, universities, and administrative buildings appeared across major cities, reflecting the confidence and ambition of the industrial age. According to the historical record, this was a time when architecture flourished. Engineers and architects experimented with new materials and bold designs. Grand structures were commissioned to represent progress, stability, and national identity. Many of the monumental buildings we see today are said to date from this period. But when we begin to examine old photographs more closely, something feels unusual. These buildings often appear remarkably complete and established, even in the earliest images that survive. The stonework looks aged. The surroundings appear settled. The structures do not always resemble newly finished construction sites. Instead, they often look as if they have already been standing there for a long time. And when historians look into the documents associated with these buildings, another detail sometimes appears. Instead of describing the moment of construction, many records speak of renovation, restoration, or adaptation. The wording suggests that something was being modified, repaired, or repurposed rather than created entirely from the ground up. This does not necessarily contradict the official timeline. Large projects often involve phases of rebuilding or expansion, yet the pattern appears frequently enough to attract attention. In many cases, the documents tell us when a building was renovated or reopened, but they say very little about its earliest beginnings. This raises an interesting question. Were all of these monumental structures truly built during the industrial boom of the 19th century? Or is it possible that some of them had already existed in another form long before the official construction dates we know today? According to most historians, the appearance of these monumental buildings is closely tied to one of the most transformative periods in modern history, the 19th century. This was the era of industrialization. Cities were growing rapidly, populations were increasing, and governments were investing heavily in infrastructure and public institutions. The historical record shows that this period brought a dramatic expansion of urban construction across Europe and North America. New technologies began to change the way buildings could be designed and constructed. The spread of railways allowed materials to be transported over long distances. Advances in engineering made it possible to build larger structures with greater efficiency. Stone, iron, and later steel could be used in ways that were not possible in earlier centuries. As a result, architects and engineers suddenly had the ability to create buildings on a scale that had rarely been seen before in modern cities. At the same time, there was a strong desire to express national identity and civic pride through architecture. Governments commissioned grand public structures that were meant to symbolize stability and progress. Large railway stations welcomed travelers arriving from distant regions. Museums were established to house growing collections of art and historical artifacts. Universities expanded as education became more accessible to a wider population. Architectural styles of the period reflected these ambitions. Neoclassical design drew inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome, with massive columns and symmetrical facades. Eclectic architecture combined elements from different historical traditions. The Beaux-Arts style, which became especially influential in the late 19th century, emphasized monumental scale, elaborate decoration, and carefully balanced proportions. The historical archives from this period appear to support this narrative. Many buildings have detailed records. We often know the names of the architects who designed them. Architectural drawings and planning documents survive in city archives. Official records list construction dates and opening ceremonies that celebrated the completion of these new landmarks. From this perspective, the explanation seems straightforward. The industrial age created the conditions for rapid construction. Cities needed large public buildings, and the technology and resources finally existed to build them. As a result, these monumental structures were erected quickly, transforming the urban landscapes we recognize today. But when researchers look more closely at some of these buildings, certain details begin to feel difficult to explain. The scale alone can be surprising. Many of these structures are enormous. Vast railway stations, massive government palaces, museums with towering columns and heavy stone facades. And according to the official timeline, some of them were completed in only 3 to 5 years. That speed raises an interesting question. In the 19th century, construction technology was still relatively limited. There were no modern cranes capable of lifting massive stone blocks dozens of meters into the air. There were no electric cutting tools, no hydraulic machinery, and no automated production lines. Most of the work relied on manual labor, simple mechanical systems, and animal power. Yet the buildings themselves are extraordinarily complex. Huge stone columns rise several stories high. Domes stretch across vast interior halls. Decorative sculptures cover entire facades. The amount of stone carving alone would have required thousands of hours of skilled craftsmanship. Some historians suggest that large teams of workers made such projects possible. Industrialization allowed cities to gather large labor forces in one place. Materials could be transported by rail, and construction could proceed day and night. Even so, another curious detail appears when historians examine the photographic record. Surprisingly, few images show these buildings in the middle of construction. In an era when photography was already widely used to document engineering projects, we might expect to see scaffolding, unfinished walls, or partially built structures. Instead, many of the earliest photographs already show the buildings fully completed. And in a few cases, old city maps appear to include these structures before the official construction dates listed in later records. None of these details prove that the buildings were older than we think, but together they create a strange impression. At times, it almost looks as if some of these monumental structures were not newly built at all, but were simply already there. To better understand these buildings, it helps to look at the broader history of cities during the 19th century. This was a time of rapid change. Across Europe and North America, urban populations were growing at an unprecedented speed. Industrial jobs were drawing people from rural areas into expanding cities. Entire neighborhoods began to transform as new streets, factories, and public institutions appeared. The historical record shows that many cities went through dramatic physical changes during this period. Fires destroyed large sections of older districts. Urban planners widened narrow medieval streets to accommodate growing traffic. Entire blocks were demolished and rebuilt as cities tried to modernize their infrastructure. What we see today in many historic city centers is often the result of several waves of reconstruction. In this environment, architects and engineers did not always begin with an empty piece of land. Quite often, they worked with what already existed. Older buildings were expanded, reinforced, or redesigned to serve new purposes. A monastery might become a university building. A royal residence might be converted into a museum or government office. Sometimes the transformation was subtle. The main structure of a building remained intact, while the exterior was redesigned to match newer architectural styles. A medieval foundation could receive a neoclassical facade. A much older structure might be extended with new wings, courtyards, or decorative elements that reflected the tastes of the 19th century. In some cases, construction projects even grew around earlier buildings. Architects might preserve the central walls or foundations while adding entirely new sections around them. From the outside, the result could appear to be a completely new structure, even though its core had existed for generations. Because of this, some historians suggest that certain buildings may have deeper histories than the dates listed in official construction records. The documents often mark the moment when a building was rebuilt or reopened, rather than the moment when its earliest structure first appeared. Supposedly appeared. City maps, architectural plans, and municipal archives can sometimes reveal a more complicated story. The historical record shows that many buildings went through several phases of transformation. What appears today as a single structure may actually be the result of centuries of gradual change. In some cases, early maps show a building standing on the same site long before the official construction date that is commonly cited. When historians study these maps more closely, they sometimes discover that the earlier structure had a different function. A religious complex might later become a university. A noble residence might eventually be transformed into a museum or administrative headquarters. Military buildings, once designed for defense, could be redesigned to serve entirely civilian purposes. Some historians suggest that these transformations were not always small renovations. In certain cases, the rebuilding process was so extensive that the final structure looked completely new. Entire facades could be replaced. Additional wings might be added. Interiors could be redesigned to serve new functions. To a casual observer, the result might appear to be a building constructed from the ground up. But when architectural historians examine foundations, floor plans, and structural elements, traces of earlier phases sometimes remain visible. The walls may be thicker than expected. The internal layout might reflect an earlier design. Stone blocks at the base of the structure could belong to an older construction period. Over time, these layers of reconstruction can make the story of a building difficult to follow. The date that appears in official records may refer only to the moment when the building was expanded, renovated, or reopened. Beneath that date, however, there may be an architectural history that reaches much further back into the past. When researchers begin comparing these buildings across different cities, another interesting detail starts to appear. The similarities between them are often striking. Many monumental structures from the 19th century share the same visual language. Enormous stone columns rise along their facades. Thick walls are built from massive carved blocks. Above them, Large domes or vaulted roofs dominate the skyline. These features appear again and again. A railway station in one country may resemble a government building in another. A museum in a European capital can look surprisingly similar to a courthouse across the Atlantic. The repetition of these architectural forms is difficult to miss. The historical record shows that certain styles were widely popular during the 19th century. Architects often looked back to earlier traditions for inspiration. Neoclassical architecture borrowed heavily from ancient Greek and Roman design. Symmetry, columns, and monumental proportions were meant to evoke stability and permanence. Later in the century, the Beaux-Arts tradition expanded these ideas with even larger scales and elaborate decoration. But when we compare buildings from different regions, the similarities sometimes go beyond stylistic influence. Structures built in Europe, the United States, and Russia can appear remarkably alike in their scale and construction methods. Massive staircases lead to rows of towering columns. Large stone domes sit above wide halls designed to hold thousands of people. For a rapidly industrializing society, this level of monumentality can feel surprising. Factories, railways, and new infrastructure define the energy of the 19th century. Yet many public buildings from the same period look more like ancient temples or Renaissance palaces than modern industrial creations. This raises an interesting question. Were these architectural forms simply a revival of older styles, carefully recreated by 19th century architects? Or could some buildings have incorporated elements that were already present long before the industrial era began? Some historians suggest that large reconstruction projects may have preserved parts of earlier structures. If that is true, then what appears today as a single 19th century building might actually contain layers of architecture from much older periods. When researchers begin to widen their view beyond a single city, the picture becomes even more interesting. Similar stories begin to appear in many different places. Large 19th century buildings with monumental architecture are not limited to one country or one historical tradition. They appear across much of the Western world. In Europe, enormous railway stations were built during the expansion of the rail network. These buildings were designed to handle thousands of travelers each day, and many of them were constructed on a scale that still feels impressive today. Massive halls, high vaulted ceilings, and long rows of columns became common features of these stations. Across the Atlantic, a similar pattern can be seen in the United States. As cities grew rapidly during the industrial age, new administrative buildings, courthouses, and government centers appeared in many urban areas. Their design often echoed the monumental architecture of older European cities. Wide staircases, tall pillars, and large domes created the sense of permanence and authority that civic institutions wanted to project. University campuses offer another example. In many cases, the central buildings of major universities were constructed during the 19th century. Yet their design often looks far older than the industrial era that produced them. Long stone corridors, classical columns, and symmetrical courtyards resemble structures from much earlier architectural traditions. When historians compare these developments across different countries, a curious pattern emerges. In some cities, monumental architecture seems to appear almost suddenly within the historical record. Large public buildings begin to dominate city squares and boulevards within a relatively short period of time. At the same time, historical documents sometimes describe these buildings using unexpected language. Instead of describing the moment they were first built, The records occasionally say that the structure was restored, renovated, or reopened. The earliest phase of construction is not always clearly described. This raises a broader question. If these buildings were already standing in some form before they were rebuilt or adapted, then how many structures in modern cities might actually be older than the dates we usually associate with them? When historians try to explain these architectural puzzles, several possible interpretations begin to appear. None of them require mysterious or hidden technologies. Instead, they suggest that the story of these buildings may simply be more complex than the simplified versions we often hear. One explanation focuses on the remarkable speed of construction during the industrial age. Some historians suggest that 19th century building projects were more efficient than we might expect today. Large numbers of workers could be organized for major projects. Materials were delivered by expanding railway networks. Skilled stonemasons and craftsmen were still widely available. Under the right conditions, enormous buildings could rise surprisingly quickly. Another interpretation points to the role of reconstruction. Many cities did not build entirely new structures, but instead transformed older ones. The historical record shows that architects frequently preserved existing walls, foundations, or interior layouts while redesigning the exterior. A new facade, a larger dome, or an expanded wing could dramatically change the appearance of a building. After such a reconstruction, the structure might be recorded as newly built, even though parts of it were much older. There is also the possibility that some construction projects were simply poorly documented. In the 19th century, record-keeping was not always as systematic as it is today. Plans could be lost, archives damaged, and early phases of construction forgotten. Over time, the surviving documents might only describe the final stage of a building's development. Finally, historians sometimes point to a simpler explanation. The way history is written often compresses complicated stories into a single date. A building may have evolved over decades or even centuries, yet in textbooks and official lists, that long process is reduced to the moment when the building was completed or officially opened. Each of these explanations offers part of the answer, but none of them fully accounts for every example, and that is what keeps the question open. The cities we live in today often feel familiar and well understood. Their streets have names, their buildings have dates, and their histories appear carefully recorded in archives and textbooks. At first glance, everything seems clear. A railway station was built in a certain year. A museum opened on a known date. A government building was completed after several years of construction. But when we begin to look closer, the story sometimes becomes less simple. Many of the structures that define our cities have not remained unchanged. Over the centuries, buildings are rebuilt, expanded, repaired, and adapted for new purposes. Walls are reinforced, facades replaced, wings added, and interiors redesigned. Each generation leaves its own layer on top of the previous one. Gradually, the original structure can become difficult to recognize beneath these changes. The historical record shows many examples of this process. A monastery becomes a university. A palace becomes a museum. A fortress becomes an administrative building. The function changes, the appearance changes, and eventually the building itself seems new, even though parts of it may be much older. Because of this, the true age of a structure can sometimes be difficult to determine. The date we associate with a building may only mark the moment it was rebuilt or officially opened, not the moment when its foundations were first laid. Of course, many of these great buildings were indeed constructed during the rapid expansion of the 19th century. Industrial cities had the resources, the labor, and the ambition to build on an enormous scale. And yet, in some cases, the story may be more complicated. This leaves us with a quiet but intriguing question. How many of the buildings around us were not actually built, but simply rediscovered?